It's gonna be a great day for AKs today. I didn't even need to use this AK today. That's how I know the day is great. You can't even play Airsoft right now. It's actually banned in Canada. Yeah guys, and that's it. Hey everybody, Beige here from Siege Airsoft. Today we're going to be talking about how we like to set up our AKs with not too many accessories and keeping it as simple as possible for usage in mixed environments such as Siege, where there's lots of long and short range engagements, and things like light and dark. For those of you who haven't seen our previous rifle setup video we uploaded last week, be sure to check that out because a lot of the same principles from that video apply to this one. AK purist and rifle is fine guys, be warned. For those of you who are saying the rifle is totally fine, you guys want to run some rifle that's been set up for the 40s or 50s, power to you to do that, but just be aware that I do think that that line of thinking is kind of what's holding the AK platform back from being used in a lot more serious ways. And if you want to say that I'm wrong, you can go look at some Russian SOF units and how they're switching to 416s now, so, you know, that's reality. If you do decide to go with the AK, you just have to be aware of its limitations. It is a weapon. The real steel counterpart was designed in the 40s, and this is compared to ARs and M4s, which were designed a few decades after that. Because of that, you're going to have some carryover and some kind of retrofitting you have to do with your gun to pretty much bring it into the modern day. This includes things like the controls of the AK being in comparatively awkward positions. So if you pick up an M4 or an AR, most of the controls can be accessed by your hands or with your middle fingers and all that stuff. You have your fire selector here, your mag release here, all that good stuff. For an AK, you have to be aware that it's all just stamped metal. And the fire selectors and things like that are going to be in kind of strange positions compared to the AR, which do lead to some limitations in how fast you can go. So for example, on this one I do have a one-handed selector, but on this more classic AK over here, the selector, if I were to want to switch it from safe, which it is now, to semi-automatic, which is what most fields use, and that is the fully bottom setting. So I would have to take my hand off my fire grip and move it all the way down. It's just small things like that you do have to consider. It's not as easy as just flicking your thumb back and forth. Another thing that you have to be aware for AKs is finding parts for it. Most of the market in Airsoft is catered towards the M4 kind of thing going on, which is why you get so many comments in a lot of YouTube videos that's, can you do a video of not an M4? But there's a legit reason why most things are M4s. It's just that the market is kind of developed around that, just like the market is mostly developed around certain kinds of phones, certain kinds of computers. So AKs would be kind of in a bit of a more snowflakey kind of area, I would call it, especially if you're in Canada. And because the real AK here, if you're into firearms, is a prohibited weapon, thanks to our wonderful government, you cannot as easily get AK platform parts such as rails, receivers, things like that are compatible. And if you do want to get airsoft parts for it, you do have to import them from overseas, which can be costly. And if you do buy an AK rail or accessories, you might expect it to fit, but you might find it doesn't. And you might need to grind or bend or add material to certain parts to shim them. It's kind of normal. As a famous real-life AK technician once said, AKs are more akin to blacksmithing over ARs, which are a bit more like building Lego. These disadvantages are probably why you don't see AKs in specific roles. For example, I have not yet seen too many AK Speedsoft guns. However, you might see that change in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. Now, what are the positives about the AK over the AR? To be honest, if you were to take everything to account, there's not too many, and this is coming from a guy that actually really likes AKs and kind of prefers the aesthetic of them over ARs. But if I were to really put it down to brass tacks, the AK does have those distinct disadvantages and challenges that I mentioned earlier. However, there are some things that people do consider to be positive. The main thing is going to be the strength and the heft, the weight of this gun, which, you know, you can see as a positive or negative because you do gain that mass and that weight. It is strong, and it really is strong. I've never really seen problems of people like twisting their AK barrels out or having their receivers crack on them. However, I do think that is a bit more of a user error thing. If you do treat your Airsoft M4 fine, it's generally going to be fine if it's from a reputable brand, just like an AK is. And if you abuse them, they're probably going to break, just like an AK might break as well. One distinct advantage that I do see is that if you are a southpaw, as this gun was designed in the lefty world at the time, although that might have changed with recent politics, this gun does have all of its controls, contrary to the AR, being on the left-hand side of the gun. The controls for the AK are on the right. So the things like the fire selector and stuff like that can be very easily accessed if you're a lefty. So I'm just going to simulate myself being a lefty right now. And if I'm a lefty, I don't need to break my fire hand to access the safety. I can just move my hand there. Or if I have a gas gun or I want a LARP, it's really easy to pull the bolt. And I'm going to grab an example mag here. If I have a magazine, because the magazine is a paddle release instead of a button release, that is true in the middle and ambidextrous, so it's really easy to insert and remove a mag no matter what hand you are using. However, all that being said, the main reason you do want to run an AK is because you want something a little bit different, something a bit more snowflakey, and it's generally quite a lot of fun. It's actually really fun to outrun guys with a really fast, speedy, speed QB, super tactical build with your heavy, outdated AK. It's a bit of a flex, so we're gonna get into that. So the next section we're gonna go into is how to choose an AK if you don't already have one. If you do have one, feel free to skip over this part, or you can watch it if you might learn something new. The first thing that people tend to focus on is brand, because Airsoft, everybody loves their brands and everybody, simps for a brand or whatever. The discussion that I do want to have is what to kind of look for if you do choose a brand. And the first thing is going to be the build material. So AKs, as they were designed in the real world, are made of steel. And if you are going with an AK, no matter what brand you go with, I would decide on getting a steel gun. There are aluminum AKs out there, and I wouldn't recommend them because it just kind of kills the soul of an AK, to be honest. If you do want to go with an AK, you are going with something different, so there is a bit of a soul to the gun, and I believe that steel kind of is that material worth of the AK. However, steel also infers to some structural advantages. Steel is going to be stronger generally than aluminum is, and it has more flexibility and hardness. Steel will also be more resistant to wear than aluminum is, so if you do drop your AK or if it bends into out of place and stuff like that, which these guns may if they take a tumble or if you really abuse them, steel tends to be more flexible and more malleable, which means you can bend it back into place. There was an example where Max's teammate had a GHK AK and he dropped it on something recently, and then it kind of collapsed in on itself, and the bolt wouldn't really reciprocate freely anymore, and they just bent it back out and it was totally fine. You can do that with a steel AK. If you do have an aluminum AK, you can probably do that too. However, aluminum generally is a harder material and not as flexible. It has more brittle properties to it, so just keep an eye out for that. So TLDR, AK should be steel, G36s should be plastic. Don't call your retailer saying that your G36 wasn't all metal. One thing that I will note for AKs is they do tend to kind of loosen up over time because a lot of the parts do rely on things like friction to work. This can include pins in the stock, folding stocks, and selectors. The biggest things that I would say are probably going to be the stocks and the selectors. There's nothing worse than picking up an AK and just like shaking it and just hearing it rattle like a high cap out of box. And a lot of that rattle does come from the stock. So if you do pick an AK, make sure you take it, have a look at it, and grab the stock by the end and give it a bit of a twist and everything like that, if the retailer lets you, of course. And make sure this doesn't wobble, because this is attached by a pin, and you can't really retighten pins. They will wear in over time, but if your stock is nice and tight, so if this AK stock over here is pretty nice and tight on this LCT, it'll just kind of wear in to be just right, but if it's loose, it's just going to wear in to be looser, and then you're going to end up with a rattly stock, and nobody really likes that. Another thing you want to keep an eye out for is the selector over here. Some brands will come with selectors that move really easily. You want your selector to have a bit of stiffness and to click positively into place. Unlike AEGs from M4s, AK selectors don't rely on like a ball bearing or gears or stuff like that. Well, gears inside, but they don't rely on any external parts to keep the selector in position other than the cut or the milling on the body and a little detent on the selector, the external selector over here. So for this AK, clicks really nicely into place. It will wear a line on the body. That's totally normal on both real and airsoft AK, so don't worry about that. But you do want to make sure that your AK selector is nice and clicky. If it is too loose, you can just tighten this screw over here either with your hand or with a pair of pliers, or some AKs has a cap over here and you can take that off and you can use a screwdriver to tighten that. The main aspect when choosing an AK, provided you pick a good brand and you pick a style that you like, is going to be the length. The most common type of AK that you will find, and likely the type that you're going to see in stores and in movies, is going to be the full-size length AK. This is a real sword Type 56 Type -2. This is a Chinese AK, and some of you might not argue that it's an AK at all, but to me, it's close enough. It's a clone of an AK, and we're going to use it for our illustrative purposes here. So this full-size AK is a full rifle-length AK, and the way you can tell is that it is obviously the longest, other than the machine gun variants. And an easy way to tell that is that it has a bit of barrel sticking out of the front gas block, and there is a front sight block over here that is separate from the gas block. Now these AKs are great because they're common, and all the accessories for AKs are generally made for the full-size AK. However, I used to run one of these, not this one specifically, but an LCT AK-74M for quite a while. And what I did find about it, especially when I started playing indoors and in mixed environments like PRZ and the college, RIP, are going to be that this AK is a bit longer and a bit harder to maneuver. This is going to be a bit longer than the carbine length AKs, but not that much heavier. But the point of that is that the weight for this AK is going to be this little extra bit of barrel in the front sight over here. And while that might not add much overall weight, because this weight is placed at the end of the muzzle, and especially if you're using a big chunky flash hider, not this one specifically, but other ones in mind, you're going to be adding a lot of mass to the front. And that really reduces the amount you can point this gun because the center of gravity has moved from around here to a bit more forward. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the subcompact carbine AKs. Now this is going to be one that you guys have been requesting quite a bit, and this is Max's wonderful AKS-74U by GHK. This is a really cool little gas gun over here, and you've probably seen it in a lot of our Instagram videos and his pretty sweet one-tap kill video that we have uploaded. If you haven't seen that, please go check it out. Now these AKs are really great because they're the opposite of this big guy over here. They're small, really pointable, really compact, and can fit in a lot of confined areas. However, as opposite as they are to this, they are also opposite in the terms of accessories. Accessories for this guy are going to be a little bit harder to find. While this might look the same as the big one, except just like put into a shrink ray, the front end is a bit different. And this will need to be found with AKS-74U specific accessories. You cannot fit full-sized AK accessory onto this, and yeah, that really limits your options as to the attachments you can find. That being said, you're able to trick it out if you can find those things. Just be aware that there will be some compatibility issues between handguards and things like that for this little guy. Over here, a little bit of a note over here is going to be on the PP19, and this is a really interesting gun. It's a bit of a newer gun in the airsoft world, but it's been with the Russian forces for quite a while now. And this is going to be the Russian MP5 or the AK submachine gun. This takes slightly different mags, which are these long guys over here. These are empty, by the way, and they fit in just like that. And they're kind of a hybrid between the Krink or the AKS-74U and the 105 in 9mm. What's interesting about this is the receiver is quite different. It has a stock dust cover rail over here, and it takes the same lower handguards as the full-size AKs, but you need to modify the tang a bit. However, this does end up with a few weird proprietary issues as well, because the top gas tube over here is a proprietary length, and you would need to find rails like that that are made for the PP19 specifically. This leads me to what I believe is the ideal sized AK, and I might be biased because this is my personal AK, but this is going to be the carbine length AK or the AK-105 or 104 depending on the mag caliber you go with. Now this is pretty much the M4 of AKs. This is going to be the mid-sized AK, so this is in between the full-sized and the baby guy over here. The way that you can tell for this one is that it looks like a full-sized AK, however with a chop in the front, and the front sight block and gas tube, front sight block and front gas block have been combined into one full unit. The advantage that this AK has is it's pretty small and pretty maneuverable, as you can see. If I were to put receiver to receiver, it's not that much bigger than the Krink, but it is quite a bit smaller than the full size. But its smaller size also does not limit it to accessories, because this guy has the same kind of accessory combo it can take as the big guy. And that's what makes it, to me, the most appealing. It is the most versatile, good mid-length, good for AEG upgrades as well in terms of efficiency and things like that. And it provides the most versatility, which is why I tend to like this length the most. Of course, length is all preference, hopefully. But whatever size you choose to go with, just make sure you practice with it, and you'll be effective no matter what environment as long as you get the reps in. Now that we have decided what kind of AK and what kind of length we want, we're going to be talking about accessories for the AKs from the tip to the rear, and the first thing on the tip is going to be the flash hider. Now AK flash hiders are a little bit different on most AKs because most AKs do use the 24mm thread, it's a bit bigger, versus the 14mm or smaller M4 or standard AEG size thread. This means that if you do want to use different muzzle devices, you have to buy either an adapter that necks it down to a 14, finding an AK specific muzzle device that takes 24mm threads, such as this big chunky suppressor over here. This is basically a muffler you're attaching on the front of your gun. It's huge. Or finding a 14mm AK like this PP19, which is taking this standard 3-prong flash hider. Now onto the fun part, which is going to be how to mount your optics and flashlights on the gun. So for AKs, they are a bit more limited in rail attachments. Rails generally are kind of more like retrofitted on the AK platform versus ARs, which they're kind of, made to have accessories on them. The main rail that I would recommend for the AK is going to be this guy right here, and this is a actually very nice real Ultimac rail. or these are also known as gas tube rails. So gas tube rails are great for a few reasons, and there are a few options of mounting optics to AKs. But I do like gas tube rails the best. And the reason is because when you put them on, you don't really need to take them off, even if you want to do some maintenance on your AK, and all the accessories can stay in one place. This one only has a red dot on it, but it would be really easy just to put a flashlight on an angled mount over here, and then you would pretty much have a complete AK for light, dark, in and outdoor environments. Gas tube rails are great because they don't move. They're really solid. They usually attach on via a clamp to the barrel or just clamping to the barrel itself. And they're really minimalist. They don't have to attach onto anything else. They just replace the entire gas tube with a Picatinny rail segment. They're fantastic. The Mark 18 of AK rails, and they are good to go. If you do want to get a bit fancier, you can go with a full handguard setup, like Max's beautiful AK over here. This also still has the similar gas tube rail and the light on the 45, as I was mentioning earlier, and has a little Zenico rail on the bottom. And this little Zenico rail allows you to attach a foregrip on here for some more comfort when shooting, especially for a shorter gun. Now, in terms of foregrips for AKs, you do want to be careful. I have a big foregrip over here. This is a CAC broom handle style grip. If you do put a big foregrip and you do put it close to your gun like this, I'm just holding it here for an example, as you can see, it does make it a bit difficult to reload the AK because the AK mags need to be rocked in. So if you have a really long grip, you might not have enough room to rock it in, or the window of opportunity to reload your AK might be a bit smaller, and that's going to be a bit more uncomfortable and a bit unwieldy. This is why you see some AK4 grips, such as the Zenico grip, has this cut over here, specifically made so that you do have room to rock the AK mag in. However, this is a PP19 and this doesn't really apply, so funny stuff. If you do want to get even fancier, I have an M-Lock SLR Rifleworks AK handguard on my gun. This also, again, has the gas tube style rail and has an M-Lock handguard on the bottom, which allows me to mount my flashlight really, really close, and just like my AR on the 45, which is where I like it, and I have room for a pressure switch on top, so it's fully ambidextrous for both hand operation. Having the gas tube have the optics and the switch or light mounted onto it creates kind of an all-in-one system. And unlike the ARs, which generally are better to have them receiver mounted, this part of the AK is really stable, the optic doesn't wobble, and it stays in line with your iron sights, allowing you to co-witness the sights if need be. The big reason I do like gas tube mounted optics and accessories is because it leaves the dust cover, which is this top part here of the AK, unimpeded. And what that means is because most AKs do take their batteries in the top, it allows me to take this off and put my battery in or do any field work that I need to do without having to remove my optic, affect my zero, affect where my light is, and all that great stuff. And I can just slap that back on, and all the front bits do not move. Having the gas tube mounted rail is much more compatible with all AKs. Not all AKs actually come with this side trunnion for sight mounting, such as the old school AKMs. So this might be your only option really for mounting optics. That being said, two other popular options, one of them which I have on table, the other I do not, is going to be the side mounted AK rail. So this is a rail that clamps on the side and puts the optic here. You probably see this one in video games or you have this one at home. It's really common and the side rails are really cheap. However, I don't like them because, like I said, they do impede with getting the dust cover off. Sometimes they don't hold zero if you put them back on, especially for the cheaper clones. And the cheaper side mounting options actually have this problem where the rail doesn't sit in line with the bore of the AK. So your scope or optic is going to be a little bit to the left or right. It doesn't really affect anything because it's airsoft and you can just compensate for the zero. But I just find it really annoying. If I'm paying money to have a nice optic and to have a nice rail, I would like it to sit where I would like it to sit. That being said, if you do have a magnified optic like a scope or a prism sight for your AK, the side rail pretty much is the only option, so, you know, it is good for that. The other option for mounting AK rails is going to be the dust cover mount. And this is a really great mount because it kind of emulates where a lot of the M4 optics kind of sit, which is around the magwell area, and it really has a nice center of gravity and good pointability. However, even with these mounts, and this is one that comes with this gun stock, is it does have a little bit of wobble. And while that might not be that important for CQB or with this EOTech style sight, it could be a real deal breaker if you have a magnified optic or if you're trying to be very precise with your gun. Additionally, these mounts need to be cantilevering, so they need to have some form of attachment on there. And that generally does also make the batteries a little bit harder to fit in because you can't really move this laterally to squeeze your battery in. But this also has the advantage of you not losing your top cover, which is nice. In terms of optic choice that I like to mount on my gas tube, Generally, most of the staff, me included, like T1 or micro style red dots, and that's because they're small, they don't add much weight to the AK, they're tubular, they kind of fit the look, and they also come mounted very low. If you notice, the distance between the AK where your cheek rests on the stock and the receiver height is already about 1/3 co-witness if you were using an AR, so please choose a low mounted optic unless you're running a big mask or something and you want a bit of a rise. So in terms of flashlights, you do have a few options, two of which I have here really, is mounting the flashlight kind of on the 45, either from the top or from the side, if you have a rail that supports that, like I have here. I personally like it on the side like this. It's just more comfortable for me, and I like how it kind of sits to the rifle. It's nice and low and slim. It makes it easy to grab around if I'm using my offhand, and if I'm using my on-hand, even easier. This is just a little airy socket light with a Surefire tape switch. Pretty simple and effective setup. Another setup if your AK supports it, and this PP19 has a bit of an interesting feature, is this PP19 has a bit of a Picatinny rail right underneath the gas block over here. And this allows you to attach a TLR or a pistol style light in the front that you can actuate ambidextrously. Having your light in line, like we said in the rifle setup video, does have a lot of advantages. It's really slim, low profile, another really great option for AKs. Now we are going to move on to grip and fire selector controls, so all in the main middle parts over here. I have an example of a standard AK pistol grip over here. So this is a standard AK pistol grip from a gas gun. Most AKs that you get are going to have this style of grip. The AEG ones will be a bit thicker. I don't really like these grips, and there's a few reasons why. I do find that this part of the tang of the grip doesn't really allow me to get nice and high to the rifle. It kind of digs into me. I kind of like the grip to terminate at the end really nicely. And also these grips tend to taper a little bit at the bottom. Not specifically these ones, but I've seen AEG ones that have a pretty bad, what I like to call ice cream cone issues. And that kind of makes the grip kind of start going like this over time, coming up. And generally for modern rifle shooting, you want your hand nice and high and tight on the rifle. So if you can replace these, I recommend it. This Type 56 actually has a really great grip out of box. It's nice. It allows your hand to ride high and allows good manipulation and good control of the rifle, especially for an AK. It is a heavier rifle, so you do want nice control over it. I also don't like grips with finger grooves on it, and I should have mentioned this last video, is because finger grooves, what I believe, give you the illusion of ergonomics. And by that, I mean it kind of tells you how to hold the gun, but not everybody's built the same, and not everybody has the same size hands and grooves to fit within those fingers. I generally like to bunch my fingers up like this, so a grip with grooves, I find I just start to rest on the grooves, and I just like my grips nice and smooth. An example, of course, is this Type 56-2 grip. These PTS palm grips, which I prefer. I don't know if they make them anymore, but if you can get them, totally recommend them. And one grip that is really easy to get and comes on some of the Arcturus guns is these MOE style grips, and I think these are actually some of the best as well. On to fire selectors. So fire selectors for AKs, as I mentioned earlier, do have the issue where you need to break your firing hand to actuate them unless you have a giant salad fingers. So this means I can't really reach it and press it down. I have to do one of these. And the way that I remedied that for my AK, and some AKs do come with this out of box, like the newer AK-12s, is adding a bit of a shelf, or buying a fire selector, sorry, with a bit of a shelf on the side, as you can see here. And this allows me to manipulate my fire selector with one hand without too much breaking of the grip. And that I find is a huge ergonomic convenience for running an AK. Finally, for the AKs on the very rear is going to be the stock. And unlike the AR, the AK actually has a lot of different stock options down there. But they're mostly focused to two groups, and that's going to be folding and fixed. For folding stocks, I don't have the classic AK-74 stock here, but I have two examples. I have this very beautiful triangle folder. This is a really iconic stock that you see on a lot of AK-74Us and some AK-74 models, as well as this PP19. I also have this little rare Type 56-2 stock. I really like this stock actually, super solid and pretty great. However, folding stocks do have some disadvantages and some advantages. The advantage of a folding stock, obviously, is you can run the gun folded. I generally don't really like this because I think shooting the gun like this is really kind of unwieldy, and I don't think you can actually get that much more compact with it because generally you're kind of holding it out here, and in my opinion, you might as well have the stock open and just hold it out there anyways. So the argument is kind of moot for me, except for maybe storage. But you know, if you like to run your gun with a folded stock, by all means. Generally, I don't see that many people hitting things like that, but that might just be me. The other big disadvantage with folding stocks are they have a fixed length of pull. And what that means is they are of fixed length. You cannot retract and extend the stock depending on if you're a battle gnome or a giant, and you have to kind of get what you get, and you got to get good with what you got. These folding stocks are also metal, and they do lack a bit of traction in the rear, so sometimes when I'm holding these guns, they sometimes can slip out of position from my shoulder. That, however, can be remedied by putting a bit of grip tape or rubber at the end, like Max has done to this Real Sword AK. The second type of stock, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be the fixed stock. And you can see this more in your classic AK-47 and AKM style guns with the classic fixed triangular wooden stock. I don't have an example of that in front of me because I generally don't really like those, because those have kind of the disadvantage of the fixed and the folding stock. The biggest advantage of the fixed stock, of course, is durability. There's no mechanism to break. They're generally a bit more solid. You don't have to worry about them either snapping, getting loose over time, stuff like that. For me, I personally liked fixed buffer tube stocks. And I know a lot of you are going to be looking at this stock and being like, that's heretical to AKs. No, it's not, because AK-12s and AK-15s and modern Russian guns are moving towards having some sort of buffer tube or adjustable stock. So suck on that. I do like buffer tube stocks because they do offer the most versatility. You can use any M4 stock out there, and there's lots of different kinds out there to your liking. They do offer more points of attachments for slings like mine over here, and they can be adjusted for length of pull. So if you're a normal size guy, not a midget and not a giant, you can find your in between or go to those midget or giant settings on your stock. One thing I also do like about buffer tube stocks is they tend to be in line with the bore, and that allows for a much more pointable AK. I don't really like the old school style stocks that kind of ride up and in. I like my guns to be a stick, like this one here. Of course, if you want to go all fancy schmancy, you can get a folding buffer tube stock, which is kind of the best of both worlds, like Max has on his AK over here. And this can be adjusted for length of pull. He likes his guns really tight into his body, so this is a folding buffer tube. However, when you do choose a folding buffer stock, most of them will not have a lock. Some of them do at the hinge actually, but most of them will not have a lock. So it's just kind of to fold to store. You can't really run it folded, or else the stock's going to be flopping around everywhere. And another caveat to mention also with folding stocks is that when you do fold them, it does occlude the side optic rail mount. So if you do want to run an optic on the side here, just be aware that when you have this folded, and if you are running a mount on it, it's not really going to be able to lock. It's going to be floating out here. So kind of limits your options. Of course, taking all this advice into account, no matter what AK you choose to go with, and no matter how you like the setup, just be sure to practice with it, get the reps in, and, you know, prove your effectiveness on the field. It's cool to have all these fancy, snowflake, interesting, weird guns, but if you're not effective on the field and all you do on YouTube is comment, can you please review a gun that's not an M4? Doesn't really prove its worth. Now, I'm gonna show you something interesting, and my personal philosophy for having multiple kinds of guns. I do see a lot of your huge arsenals out there, and that's totally cool, but I kind of, over the years, have dwindled the importance of the gun in the airsoft experience, although, you know, it might seem like I like to talk about them, and I do, because honestly, they all just shoot BBs, and all of this is just about setting your gun up to shoot a BB in an effective way that's comfortable to you. I really only have two guns left, and one of them is the one you see here in our previous video, which is my M4, and the other one is going to be my AK. You notice how these guns are set up. They're set up really similarly to each other. They have pretty much the same length, and the manipulations and the operations, other than the M4 buttons and switches and the AK buttons and switches, are in the same place. Because these guns are similar, this allows me to play and practice with this one, and play and practice with this one, and have a lot of the same skills carry over. I don't have to worry about different manipulations. And because both of these lengths are around the same size, I find them effective in both in and outdoors use, and I've used them in multiple fields for a number of years. So guys, the end of this video really is just going to be keep your weapon simple. Don't think too much about it. Just set it up to how you like it with these things in mind. Keep it efficient, get some practice, and we hope to see you out there sometime soon. Thank you for watching.